Hi, welcome back to Philosophy 101, Morals in Society at Honolulu Community College. I am Chrisanne Moore. And today we're going to do program 15, which is the second half of Aquinas' natural law theory. Here I am. I got the same outfit on, so you'll know that we're just continuing. Last episode we talked about the fact that Thomas Aquinas succeeded in getting the church to re-accept reason and observation as methods of knowing. Since the fall of Rome and the domination of the Catholic Church had taken the position that reason was antithetical to faith, that actually true knowledge could only be obtained through absolute faith in God, belief in God's revelation in the Bible, and the interpretation of that revelation by the authority of the Catholic Church. This position would really hold sway for 1,000 years. Between the fall of Rome around 500 AD, really 476, but right around 500 AD, until around 1500 AD, the church would be the single dominant power in the Western world. And philosophy would be rejected as a way of knowing. In fact, it would be considered dangerous, because when people reason for themselves, they come up with different answers. The church was threatened by that, for one, because some truly believe that once people reason for themselves, they will be led astray. That reason without faith is meaningless. That reason without faith will take you down the wrong path and indeed result in your eternal damnation. Secondly, the church was threatened by reason because reason could question the authority of the church, and such questioning could possibly lead to a loss of that authority. The church was able to retain absolute political control for 1,000 years. However, in the middle of this 1,000-year period is Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas is able to get the church to accept Aristotle. Aristotle has re-arrived in the West through really the Crusades and the confrontation with Islam, between the West and Islam. Part of the booty that the West receives in those battles are translations of Aristotle. This vast categorized knowledge that Aristotle had compiled becomes available, and more importantly, Aristotle's methods become available. Reason and observation. And Aquinas convinces the church to re-accept reason and observation, arguing God gave us reason to know his laws. Therefore, we must be meant to use our reason. God created nature, and it runs by God's laws. Therefore, reason used to determine the laws of nature will determine God's laws. And since God would not contradict himself, the laws of nature and the laws in the Bible would not contradict each other. Reason and observation can only support the Bible. So, Thomas Aquinas sets about using reason and observation to discover the laws of nature and really to confirm Christian doctrine. In doing so, he creates his great Summa Theologica, and the part we're interested in is the ethical theory that he develops, natural law theory. Natural law theory becomes really the basis for much of Western ethics for actually until today. It's still of extreme importance today. There is the Bible, the Judeo-Christian ethic, and there is the natural law theory developed by Thomas Aquinas, which becomes fundamental Western ethics. As we saw, Aquinas uses Aristotle's definition of the good. The good is that which all things aim for, the final purpose inherent in that thing's nature. The good for human beings is that which human beings naturally aim for, the final purpose inherent in human nature. And Aquinas says that reason and observation reveals that human beings aim for 4 fundamental values. Let's look at those 4 fundamental values again, because they are the very essence of this theory. Those 4 fundamental values are life, knowledge, sociability, and procreation. Therefore, morality and immorality are very clearly set out by these values. To violate the 4 fundamental values is immoral, and to promote them is moral. Once again, immoral, any violation of the 4 fundamental values. Moral, to promote the 4 fundamental values. Of course, Aquinas says that the violation is much more weighty than the promotion, that really one is obligated never to violate the 4 fundamental values in oneself or in others. And when we look at those things that violate the 4 fundamental values, we really do see fundamental Western morality. For example, suicide is considered a violation of life, the first fundamental value. Therefore, suicide is always considered immoral in the West. That's not necessarily true in other cultures. There are other cultures in which suicide can be considered an honorable choice. Japanese culture, for instance. That is not so in the West. Suicide is always considered an immoral choice. Any violation of knowledge, lying or preventing someone from knowing the truth or pursuing truth is a violation. Anything that prevents intimate relationships or the creation of community is a violation. And of course, any sexuality that occurs outside of a lifelong marriage or actually does not occur within a lifelong marriage between a man and a woman with the final purpose of bearing children is considered immoral. And a large amount of our morality around sexuality is determined by the value of procreation as it's put forward by Thomas Aquinas. Really, what Aquinas is saying is that a heterosexual, lifelong marriage for the bearing of children is endowed by God as proper human behavior, as the final purpose of human beings. And so we have the very basis of natural law theory. Of course, one cannot really live without violating the 4 fundamental values at some point or another. The 4 fundamental values alone makes it impossible to defend oneself, and it actually makes criminal justice system impossible. And Aquinas recognized this. So quite brilliantly, he came up with 2 exceptions, and only 2 circumstances under which one may violate the 4 fundamental values and remain moral. And so now what we're going to do is look at those exceptions, those circumstances under which one can violate the 4 fundamental values and remain moral. The first of these is called forfeiture. Now, forfeiture excuses a violation of the 4 fundamental values if that violation is against a non-innocent for the immediate protection of the innocent or for justice by the government. Don't worry, we'll break that down. You see, forfeiture means to give up. You've probably heard it before. If you're playing basketball and the other team doesn't show up, you say they forfeited the game and you win. Or you're sitting around playing Monopoly and somebody gets up and takes a phone call and they're gone for an hour, you skip their turn. And when they come back, you say, you forfeited your turn. Well, in natural law theory, forfeiture means to give up one's rights to the fundamental values. The way you give up your rights to the fundamental values is by violating the 4 fundamental values. Anyone who violates the 4 fundamental values is considered non-innocent. A non-innocent may be violated if that violation is necessary for the protection of the innocent or for justice by the government. Okay, let's look at that. Forfeiture exception excuses a violation of the 4 fundamental values if the person who is violated by the act is non-innocent, in other words, guilty, and the act is only to the extent necessary for immediate protection of the innocent or for justice by the government. Now let's look at some examples that'll make that much clearer. Let's think of this. You're walking down the street and you happen to have a bat and you see a rape in progress. Now if you take that bat and you use it to stop that rape and you harm the rapist in the process, you have done a moral act. Why? Well, if you use that bat, naturally you're going to harm the life or health of that rapist. So you have violated the fundamental values. But the violation is excused by forfeiture because you have violated a non-innocent. The rapist, of course, violated the fundamental values. The rapist is non-innocent. The rapist is guilty. Therefore, you're harming The life and health of that rapist is moral because you have done it to protect an innocent. Now, let's look this further, though. You can only violate the 4 fundamental values for immediate protection of the innocent, which you have done, and only to the extent necessary. So, if you harm the rapist, you stop the rape, you cannot continue to keep beating the rapist up. Why? Because it is no longer necessary for immediate protection of the innocent, and it is beyond the extent necessary. Now you're acting on your own rage. Now you're usurping the role of the government for justice. You can't do that. You can only act to the extent necessary for immediate defense of the innocent. So, for example, say the rapist gets away, and then you're walking down the street the next day and you see him. You still can't take your bat and hit him. Why? Because it is no longer necessary for the immediate defense of the innocent. If you act now, you would be usurping the role of the government. So, forfeiture allows for defense of the innocent. Forfeiture allows for self-protection, and forfeiture allows for justice by the government. For indeed, if the government apprehends the rapist, the government is allowed to violate the fundamental values of that rapist. The government is allowed to jail them, to prevent them from sociability. The government is allowed to punish. You see, forfeiture allows for criminal justice and self-defense. It also allows for a just war, which is something we'll talk about later. Let's look at another example for forfeiture, however. Let's say someone breaks into your house. Well, that person has immediately broken the 4 fundamental values. So, you are allowed to protect yourself and your family. You are allowed to do whatever is necessary to protect yourself and your family, even if that means harming the person who broke into your house. However, it cannot be beyond the extent necessary. In other words, you cannot just shoot someone who breaks into your house. You can only shoot someone who's broken into your house if you prove that it was to the extent necessary. Usually that means that they would have to have a gun. You see, this is why you can actually get arrested for shooting somebody who's broken into your home. Some of the fundamental values in natural law theory have been incorporated into our civil laws. And even now, if someone breaks into your home and you shoot them, if you can't prove that that shooting was necessary, you're going to end up in jail. Because you can't act beyond the extent necessary for immediate defense of the innocent. And you cannot usurp the role of the government in performing justice. You see, Aquinas was very clear that he did not approve of vigilante justice, that individual citizens could not take the role of the government and decide who was guilty and who was innocent and then enact retribution. That, in fact, Aquinas would say, would cause chaos in a society, and the individual citizen cannot determine what is just in the criminal case. So vigilante justice, mob vengeance, was disallowed. You cannot usurp the role of the government, but you can protect yourself and other innocents as long as you are acting against someone who is themselves non-innocent. You cannot damage or harm an innocent, no matter how many people that act might save. Let's look at another example. This is actually a true story that is told of a pioneer village in the West in the 19th century. The pioneers, of course, had settled on Indian lands, and there were wars between the pioneers and the Indians, and sometimes they were very, very brutal. Well, at this one point, an Indian tribe was taking vengeance. And the villagers knew they were coming, and they knew what was going to happen when the Indians arrived, that in fact they were in tremendous amount of danger. So the villagers left and they hid in a barn outside of the village, not far outside, and the village huddled, hoping when the Indians came they would find the village empty and move through. However, as the villagers huddled in the barn, a baby began to cry. And of course, the wailing of the baby was carrying over the fields and would give them all away. And so the mother suffocated her baby. Now, one might argue that she was defending the innocent, that she was saving the life of the village, for indeed the Indians did pass through, and the villagers remained unharmed except for the baby. But as soon as the Indians passed through, the villagers hung that woman for murder. You see, natural law theory, and the villagers were natural law theorists, you cannot harm one innocent, even if it would save thousands of innocents. There are probably other problems with that case, too, that we'll talk about in other moral theories. But just to give you an example, you cannot harm one innocent if it would save thousands. You cannot violate life and health, except that of a non-innocent, for immediate defense of the innocent, or for justice by the government. Actually, there's a contemporary ethical issue, which is really an issue of forfeiture. You've probably heard of Megan's Law. Now, Megan's Law allows for the addresses of known child molesters to be published on the internet and to be available for those in the neighborhood of the child molester. Now, the reason these individuals are known as child molesters is that they have been arrested, tried, served their time in jail, and they are now free. So there are those who argue that the Megan's Law violates these people's rights, that these people have served their time, that they have a right to start their lives over again, and they have a right to be free of their past crimes once those crimes have been paid for. However, there are others who argue that Megan's Law is indeed just. And their argument is basically a forfeiture argument. Their argument is that, first of all, child molesters have harmed these children for life. As we all know, these crimes take their toll for the rest of a person's life often. So, they argue since the violation, the victim suffers for life, the molester has forfeited their rights for life. They no longer have any rights. They have given their rights up. Secondly, they argue, child molesters, more often than not, end up back in jail. The sad fact is it seems to be an incurable disease. And something like 82% of child molesters are rearrested for the same crime. And the horrible fact is that before they are rearrested, they often damage dozens more children. And so these people argue that these neighborhoods contain children. And so Megan's Law is necessary for the immediate defense of the innocent against a non-innocent. You'll have to see for yourself what you think of Megan's Law. But the argument is fundamentally an argument about forfeiture, which allows for defense of the innocent against the non-innocent to the extent necessary, or it allows for justice by the government. But on top of the exception of forfeiture, Aquinas also recognized that there are very few acts which are wholly good or wholly bad. That in fact, there are a great number of acts which have more than one consequence. And one of those consequences may be a violation, whereas another of those consequences may be a promotion of the fundamental values. And so Aquinas talked about the doctrine of double effect, which provides another exception where violations of the four fundamental values may still be considered moral. Now, Aquinas himself actually wrote very little on double effect, but natural law theorists that have followed since him have written a great deal about the doctrine of double effect. So, the doctrine of double effect provides for an exception to violations of the four fundamental values if that violation is an unintended, unavoidable side effect of a good action where the resulting good outweighs the bad. Okay, the doctrine of double effect. A violation of the four fundamental values can be excused if it is an unintended, unavoidable side effect of a good action in which the resulting good outweighs the bad. In order to apply the doctrine of double effect, let's break it down into 4 questions that really need to be asked. In order to see if an action is excused by the doctrine of double effect, you must ask these 4 questions. Is the action itself good? In other words, is the action not a violation of the 4 fundamental values? The violation has to be a side effect, not the action itself. Secondly, is the bad side effect unintended? In other words, the violation can't be on purpose. It cannot be what you were hoping to achieve. Third, is the bad side effect absolutely necessary for the good to be achieved? Is it unavoidable? In other words, if the good can be achieved some other way, then you must do that other way. However, if this violation is the only way to achieve the good, then it is excused. And fourth, does the resulting good outweigh the resulting bad of the side effect? This is the doctrine of proportionality. The good must ultimately outweigh the bad. And to apply the doctrine of double effect, all 4 questions must be answered yes. If the action is indeed good, the bad side effect is indeed unintended and unavoidable, and in the end, the good outweighs the bad, then that violation is considered moral. Again, this will be made much clearer by a few examples. For our first example, let's look at a situation I'm sure all of you are familiar with. On September 11th, 2004, a plane was hijacked over Pennsylvania. 2001, September 11, 2001, a plane was hijacked over Pennsylvania. Now, the passengers of that plane had used their cell phones, and calling the ground, they had found out that the World Trade Center had been already attacked by a plane. A plane had been driven into the World Trade Center, and a plane had been driven into the Pentagon. So they were fairly sure that the hijackers, the Islamic extremists who had hijacked their plane, were intending to do the same. And so some of the passengers on that plane got together and decided to attack the hijackers. They hung up their cell phones and attacked the hijackers. In the process of trying to regain control of the plane crashed. Was this action moral? Well, obviously there was a violation of the 4 fundamental values. Everyone died. Was the violation excused by forfeiture? Well, first we must ask, were the people who were violated non-innocent? Well, yes, in terms of the death of the hijackers, they were certainly non-innocent. They had violated the fundamental values. So their death is excused by forfeiture. They were non-innocent, and their death was necessary for the immediate defense of the innocent. But what about all the other passengers who died? What of all the innocents who died in that act? That violation cannot be excused by forfeiture. They were innocent. Even though their death was necessary for the immediate defense of the innocent, they were innocent. So, this is where the doctrine of double effect comes in. We must ask the 4 questions. Is the action itself good? Well, yes. Acting to defend the innocent is a good thing. Acting to prevent a horrific act is a good thing. They acted actually to promote the 4 fundamental values. And so the action itself is good. Is the bad side effect of that action unintended? That's the second question. Well, what is the bad side effect? The death of innocents. Was that intended? No, of course they did not intend to do that. They tried to save the innocents. And so the death of the innocents was an unintended side effect. So the question, was the bad side effect unintended? Yes. The bad side effect was unintended. Was the action absolutely necessary for the good to be achieved? Was the action unavoidable? Was there anything else they could have done? No. This was their only choice. They did the one thing that they could have done. And so, to answer the question, was the action absolutely necessary to achieve the good? Yes, it was. And finally, the last question, does the resulting good outweigh the bad? Well, one would argue, yes, they saved thousands of lives. Who knows where that plane was headed? Who knows where it might have crashed? Who knows how many thousands would have been killed? So, the sacrifice of a few lives in the end to save many, many others, certainly the good outweighs the bad. So yes, the act is considered moral. In fact, more than that, most people consider those passengers who tried to regain control of the plane to be heroes. So that illustrates why the doctrine of double effect is necessary. Sometimes a good action has an unintended bad side effect, but it is still a good action, but only under very specific circumstances as far as Aquinas is concerned. Let's look at another example. This example is actually adapted for one by C.E. Harris in his book Applying Moral Theory. In this case, a woman is 4 months pregnant, and she finds out she has severe tuberculosis, life-threatening. There is one medication that will help her, and only one. However, taking this medication will abort the fetus. Is taking the medication moral? Well, let's look at it from Aquinas' natural law theory. If she takes the medication, the fetus will be aborted. Is that a violation? Well, one of the difficulties in applying natural law theory is one has to define life. And we have no easy definitions of life. You will find that again and again in this course. When we try to say, what is life? We end up having to argue our definitions because science, philosophy cannot tell us a certain answer to when life begins. Now, for this example, we will say that since the fetus is 4 months, we will consider it a life. There's no evidence Aquinas would have thought so, and this is still controversial today. But for the sake of this theory, we'll define the 4-month fetus as a life. In your cases, you will have to make that decision for yourself. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But for now, let's say the fetus is a life. If she takes the medication, she will abort that fetus. So there is a violation. There's a violation of the fundamental value of life. Can that violation be excused by forfeiture? Well, we must first, is the person being violated non-innocent? Well, who's being violated? The fetus. Is the fetus non-innocent? No, of course not. The fetus has done nothing. The fetus remains innocent, and therefore the action cannot be excused by forfeiture, even though it may be argued that the action is necessary for self-defense. So, the violation of life is not excused by forfeiture. We can go on to the doctrine of double effect. Is the action an unintended, unavoidable side effect of a good action? Well, let's ask the first question. Is the action itself good? Well, here's where it gets dicey because you have to define what the action is. But in this case, it may be clear the action is taking a medication to save your life. The action is actually a promotion of the fundamental value of life. So the action itself is good, yes. Is the bad side effect of that action, the abortion of the fetus, unintended? Certainly not the mother's intention to abort her fetus. It was not her wish. It is not what she wants to accomplish. It's not the means by which she is saving her life. And so, yes, the side effect is unintended. We have 2 yeses so far. Let's go to the third question. Is the bad side effect unavoidable for the good to be achieved? Is the bad side effect absolutely necessary? Well, I said before, there's only one medication. There is no other medication. So, yes, the action is absolutely necessary. The bad side effect cannot be avoided. So we have another yes. You see, if there was any other medication she could take, she would have to take that medication. But since, as I said, there is no other medication, yes, it's unavoidable. Finally, does the resulting good outweigh the bad? Well, in this case, we're looking at a situation that threatens both the mother and the fetus, as opposed to a situation which threatens only the fetus. So saving the mother's life, as opposed to possibly losing both the mother and the fetus, the good outweighs the bad. So in this case, her taking the medication is excused by the doctrine of double effect. Let's look at third example. This third example will illustrate another aspect of Aquinas' natural law theory, and that is a just war theory. You see, Aquinas used the doctrine of double effect and forfeiture, basically, to formulate the theory of what would be a just war. In other words, what would be a moral war. Now, there are moral theories that think that there is no such thing as a moral war. However, there have been many just war theories. Thomas Aquinas' is just one, except it's extremely influential just war theory. So let us look at the just war theory and how forfeiture and double effect function within a just war theory. Now, before we do that, there are certain other conditions which Aquinas stipulated for a just war, most of which are included in many just war theories. First of all, Aquinas would say a just war must be declared by a recognized government. In other words, individuals or groups of individuals within a nation cannot declare a war or cannot perform acts of war. A just war must be declared by a recognized government. In fact, this is how we differentiate acts of terrorism from acts of war. Acts of war are declared by a government. Terrorist acts are conducted by individuals. Secondly, a just war must have a just cause. In other words, there must be a reason to go to war that is moral. Now, we cannot cover in this class all of those things that are considered just causes for war. We'll simply say that self-defense, defense of the innocent against a non-innocent, is a just cause for a war in Aquinas' natural law theory. So declared by a recognized government and must have a just cause. And finally, a just war must have a just aim. In other words, the purpose of that war the purpose of that war must be just. In other words, the purpose of any war must be the restoration of peace. The purpose of any war must be the restoration of a stable state and society and peace for the people. So, and on top of that, each act within the war must be just. Each act within a war must pass forfeiture and the doctrine of double effect in order to be considered just or moral. So, in summary, let's look at the conditions for a just war. Conditions for a just war in natural law theory. Declared by a recognized government, must have a just cause, must have a just aim, and each action taken must be just. And to determine whether the action is just, we must look at forfeiture and double effect. So, in order to do this, let's look at the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Towards the end of World War II, the United States government decided to drop atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Within moments after the bombs were dropped, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, and the effects of radiation from those atomic bombs destroyed health for generations. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki moral according to Aquinas' natural law theory? Well, first we must ask, was it a just war? The war was declared by a recognized government, the United States of America and Japan. Did the war have a just cause? Well, many people would say yes, because Japan had attacked the United States in Pearl Harbor. Did the war have a just aim? Most people would say yes, that the aim of the war was the restoration of peace, eventually. So, is this act, was this bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki just? Well, let's look at the forfeiture exception. There's no question, obviously, there's a violation of life and health and many other of the four fundamental values. But we'll just look at that violation. Is it excused by forfeiture? Well, first we must say, were those who were violated non-innocent? In order to do this, we have to look, who do you consider non-innocent in war? Because in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed. So who do we define as innocent and non-innocent? Well, it may not surprise you that the definition of who is non-innocent is not so easy in war. Usually, it is recognized that any member of the military is considered non-innocent in wartime. Therefore, members of a military may be violated. In addition, defense workers are generally considered non-innocent in wartime. In other words, if you are working in the defense industry, if you are at a factory or working on bombs or munitions, you are considered non-innocent in war. In general, civilians are considered innocent, although this isn't accepted by everyone. There are those who argue that in a democracy, like the United States of America, the citizens vote on their leaders. The citizens have a say in what their leaders do. Therefore, in war, all the citizens of a democracy are non-innocent. However, these same people argue that those under a tyranny, those who live under a dictatorship, have no say in the actions of their government. Therefore, those civilians who live under a tyranny or a dictatorship are innocent. This theory, of course, is not very popular in the United States. Because, of course, by this theory, every citizen of the United States is considered non-innocent in wartime. We will, for our purposes, stay with the standard definition that civilians are innocent. But you should remember there are those who consider the citizens of America non-innocent in war. And whether you agree or disagree with them, it is worth noting that the citizens of a democracy are, to a large degree, responsible for the actions of their government. That we do vote. Or if you don't vote, you're still responsible, because not voting was your choice. So it is well worth asking whether you support or do not support the actions of your government. Let's get back to our example, however. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed. Those civilians are, by the definition we are using, innocent. And therefore, even if it can be argued that the action was necessary for defense, you cannot kill innocents. So the action is not excused by forfeiture. Therefore, we go on to the doctrine of double effect. The first question, is the action good? Well, actually, an action taken in war aimed at ending that war is considered a good action. And there are those who argue that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessary to move towards the end of the war. Others disagree. But even if we say the action was an action taken in war to end a war and therefore passes the first question, we must go to the second question. Was the bad side effect, the killing of innocents, unintended? And here we must say no. In fact, the bombing of innocents was intended. We have documents by the U.S. government that says that they purposely wanted to terrify the Japanese people, to terrorize the Japanese people by killing so many innocent civilians. And so the death was intended. We get a no. Once you have a no, you cannot be excused by the doctrine of double effect. And so the action is immoral, according to Thomas Aquinas' natural law theory. However, for purposes of demonstration, let's go on to our third and fourth question. The third question was, is the bad side effect unavoidable for the good to be achieved? Well, in this case, the good to be achieved was the ending of the war. Was this action necessary, absolutely necessary, in order to achieve the end of the war? There are different arguments on this one. There are those who will argue that that action was necessary to end that war. There are others who say that was not necessary to end the war. The war could have been ended in another way. You see, this is a great example of the fact that morality is not math. Philosophy does not give you absolute, sure, 2 + 2 = 4 answers. That in each case, an argument must be made. And so I'll leave this one up to you. What is your argument? Was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki unavoidable to achieve the good of ending the war, or was it not? Was it avoidable? Could something else have been done? Let's say the same of the fourth question. The fourth question is, does the good outweigh the bad? Does the death of hundreds of thousands of people and radiation for years have come, is that outweighed by the fact that the war was indeed ended? You see, there are those who argue that thousands more would have eventually died if the war continued. There are those who argue that the war could have been ended another way, and that these deaths far outweigh any good that could have been achieved by dropping those bombs. Once again, you must make that argument. Once again, you must decide, did the good outweigh the bad? Just as you must decide, was there another way? But it is worth noting that since the deaths of innocents were intended, it does not pass and was immoral by natural law theory. It doesn't matter that it ended the war. It doesn't matter if you think the good outweighed the bad. It doesn't matter if it was unavoidable. You cannot intentionally kill innocents as a means to saving others in natural law theory. Just as you cannot kill one child to save a village, you cannot add people up and say, well, if we kill so many and we save this many, well, it's got to be moral. You see, in natural law theory, human lives are not co-measurable. What that means is that you cannot reduce human life to numbers and then add them up. So and so many human lives over here and so many human lives over here. That's true in other theories, but not in natural law. See, a human life is not a number and can't be reduced to a number. This is illustrated actually by another trolley car in this case. I told you there's lots of trolley car cases in ethics. This is another trolley car case. Let's look at a trolley car case from the view of natural law theory. You're speeding down a track on a trolley car, and your brakes give out, and ahead of you on the track are 5 people. You will most assuredly kill if you speed into them. You have one choice. You can turn over onto a sidetrack, and on the sidetrack are 2 people. What should you do? Do you go ahead and hit 5 people, or do you turn the wheel and hit 2? Well, many people would think, naturally, you save 5, hit 2. Natural law theory would say no. You can't add people up. You can't say 5 and 2, and 5 is greater than 2. Human lives are not numbers. You see, you don't know. The 5 ahead of you on the track could be 5 escaped murderers from a nearby prison. They could be rapists. They could be horrible human beings. The 2 over here could be raising 26 children between them, own businesses whose livelihoods, own businesses that provide livelihood to hundreds of people. You can't add people up like numbers and decide this many and we'll save this. Not in natural law theory. So what would you do? Well, actually, in natural law theory, you would do nothing. You see, you would just let the trolley car go ahead. Because if you cannot make a choice which promotes the 4 fundamental values, and your only choice would violate the 4 fundamental values, then you should let nature take its course. you should do nothing. You see, this reveals once again the fundamental reasoning behind natural law theory. Aristotle's theory and Aquinas' theory are based on the idea that everything in nature has a purpose, and that purpose is good. Therefore, even if the good of the purpose may not seem apparent to you, the only way you can promote good is either to aid things to achieve their final purpose or to get out of the way and let nature take its course. You can help nature by promoting the fundamental values. You can help nature by refusing to violate the fundamental values. But when it comes down to it, it's better not to choose than to violate. It's better to allow nature to take its course. Now, this only becomes reasonable to the modern mind if one actually does believe there is a final purpose. If one actually does believe that inherent in nature and events and in life, there are purposes which are ultimately good. So, the four fundamental values, forfeiture, and the doctrine of double effect, is the first time really Aquinas gives us a very simple, straightforward way to take a case or an issue and to argue whether it is moral or immoral. We are now moving at least towards modern times. We're in the high Middle Ages, and we have a step-by-step moral theory, which is actually fairly simple. Of course, the simplicity of Aquinas' natural law theory may in fact be its biggest flaw. So now what I want to do is look at some of the flaws in Thomas Aquinas' natural law theory. As I said, all moral theories have flaws. There is no perfect moral theory. That should be obvious. If there was a perfect moral theory, we wouldn't need college classes in ethics. If there was a perfect moral theory, you would have all the answers. You wouldn't be able to strive and struggle for your own answers. You wouldn't be able to decide what you think is moral and what you do not think is moral. There is no perfect moral theory because the methods of human reasoning and knowledge and even revelation are not perfect. And so natural law theory too has its flaws. First of all, natural law theory is absolute. If it's a violation of the four fundamental values, it cannot be excused, except by forfeiture and the doctrine of double effect. That's it. These two are brilliant, but that is it. There is no accounting for individual circumstances. There is no accounting for the obstacles of individual decisions. Actually, there's very little individuality at all in natural law theory. You see, this is another flaw in Thomas Aquinas' theory. Thomas Aquinas, as Aristotle, assumes that all human beings aim for the same final purpose, that these fundamental values apply to all human beings. In the modern era, we don't necessarily think that. We think, of course, that different human beings have different purposes, that maybe we don't all strive for the same things. Maybe the same things aren't good for all of us. Maybe there are other values. Maybe individuality needs to be taken into account a little bit more than Aquinas and Aristotle did. You see, both Aquinas and Aristotle were looking to establish objective moral theories, theories that were true for all human beings, that could not be a matter of opinion or culture or tradition or power. But this loss of individuality can be a problem. And of course, many people think the greatest flaw in Thomas Aquinas' natural law theory is in the fundamental value of procreation. Many people disagree that sexuality's final purpose is the bearing of children. There are people who think that sexuality has many other purposes. Sexuality may have the purpose of intimacy. Sexuality has the purpose of bonding between people. Sexuality has the purpose of pleasure for people. And so there are those who are natural law theorists even today who accept all of natural law theory except for the fourth fundamental value, which is procreation. So let's look at that on a slide and go over those again. The flaws in natural law theory, it's absolute. It assumes all human beings share the same purpose. And many believe that sexuality has other purposes besides procreation, such as intimacy and pleasure. And of course, when Thomas Aquinas was formulating his natural law theory, he was steeped in the culture of the Middle Ages. His reason and his observations, were all made through a very specific cultural lens. He interpreted things through the lens of his culture. And therefore he saw things as one would in the Middle Ages. He also set about proving church doctrine, and actually was extremely successful in doing that. His theory was meant to uphold the authority of the church, the revelation of the Bible, and the ideas that already existed within the Catholic Church. So it's a very little surprise that he succeeded in doing exactly that. Nevertheless, say it is an elegant theory. It's an elegant theory of extreme persuasive value, which has laid out some of the fundamental values in the West. We still talk about whether something's natural or not. And when we say something's natural or unnatural, we're often using that to mean if it's natural, it's good. If it's unnatural, it's bad. And things are condemned because they are unnatural. However, a lot of people use those words incorrectly. You see, when Thomas Aquinas says something is natural, he doesn't mean it naturally occurs. When Thomas Aquinas uses the word natural, and when the ethical theory is being used properly, natural refers to those things nature aims for. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. Lying is natural. We lie naturally. Aquinas would say that is not what nature aims for. Poison is natural. There are many things that occur in nature which are not considered to be good. Aquinas is saying those things nature aims for are good. But perhaps the greatest contribution of Aquinas, after all, is the fact that he reintroduced Aristotle in a way that was acceptable to the Catholic Church. And in the process, philosophy was reintroduced into the West in a way that was extremely important, because you see, Aristotle was about reason and observation of nature. Whereas the Dark Ages had rejected nature as a veil of tears to be passed through, now nature was seen as an expression of the mind of God. Natural laws were thought of as expressing God's laws, and therefore science could be reborn. And really, science was conceived of as attempting to understand the mind of God, as it is written in the book of nature. Nature began to be seen as a revelation of the mind of God. And so, the transcendentalism of the church, the looking to another world, the seeking after salvation and transcendence would remain an integral part of the Western vision. But now, this world was once again imbued with value. Exploration of this world could once again go forward, and value in this world. And so the entire technological emphasis that we find in the West is reborn just because it is Aristotle that is discovered, and because Aquinas gets the church to accept Aristotle. In our next episode, we'll look at what happened after Thomas's life. We will look at how science begins to change the Western mind. In the meantime, you should go over and read your chapter on natural law theory, and of course begin now to apply natural law theory to those cases given to you in the back of your textbook and on the web, so that you begin to understand and use this vocabulary of determining moral and immoral that has been at the basis of Western society. And you may find, indeed, that you are a natural law theorist, that you agree with much of natural law. Next episode, we'll be looking at a film which will give you a chance to examine your reaction or feelings about one of these fundamental values and begin to apply the steps of natural law theory as well. And then we will find after that after Aquinas, a vigorous anti-rationalism became the norm once again. Once again, for a short period of time, reason was rejected as a way of determining morality. Morality would once again become the sole province of the church. However, science could not be held back. Although we would not have another major ethical theory for several hundred years, which we will talk about in the episode after the film, science will proceed. The gate will have been opened by Aristotle, and exploration of nature will proceed. And in fact, it will proceed without those assumptions that had been given it by Aristotle. So, I'll see you next time for the film. In the meanwhile, take care. Bye-bye.